Übercharge is the closest thing that Team Fortress 2 has to an ultimate ability. It takes the better half of a minute to fully charge, and upon activation it makes both the medic and his heal target impervious to any player damage for 8 seconds. New players often struggle with knowing when to use Uber, who to use it on, and also what to do when you are the one who's getting Ubered. Despite being a simple mechanic at its core, proper usage of Uber is an incredibly complex subject that even veteran competitive players can struggle with. Today, I hope to demystify Übercharge for beginner and intermediate players and reinforce the existing knowledge of longtime players. Obviously, there are already guides about Übercharge from a medic's point of view on YouTube. I am definitely not a medic main, so this guide will be mostly focused on the perspective of the player who is receiving the Uber, although I suspect the information this video contains will be useful to medic mains as well. Before I delve too far into any specific decision making, I think it's important to define what makes an Uber good or bad in the first place. As with most things in tf2, this is very nuanced and depends heavily on the situation. That being said, there are a few universal truths. Firstly, Übercharge takes at a minimum 40 seconds to build, ignoring any Ubersaw shenanigans, and it requires the medic to not die as he is building the Uber. Obviously, if you die, you lose any and all progress, so as the age-old adage goes, pop it, don't drop it. But also, try not to pop it unnecessarily. A common theme when it comes to playing medic is risk management, and knowing when to hold onto the Uber despite risk is an important skill to have. In a game like TF2, 40 seconds is a long time. Good medics avoid wasting their Übercharge whenever possible. I have heard players much better than myself describe it this way. If you achieve something with an Uber that could have been done easily without using Uber, the Uber was bad. This begs the question, what can you do with Uber that you cannot normally do? To put it more simply, what is Uber good at? Well, some common sentiments are that Übercharge is meant to break holds, clear out NG nests, or to get frags. While Uber can be used for these things, and it often is, a good Uber does not require any of these things to happen. That is because Übercharge is, by definition, an entirely defensive tool. At the end of the day, all an Übercharge really does is prevent damage. The patient may or may not actually deal any damage during the duration of the Uber. To put it as densely as I can, a good Uber helps the team progress towards completing the objective. In the context of attack defend, payload, 5CP, and King of the Hill, this is different for both attack and defense. When defending, an Uber might not get any kills or make any space for the defending team, but it could be an insanely good Uber by simply keeping people alive and healthy, therefore maintaining map control. You will see this a lot in competitive game modes such as Highlander, where the defending team uses an Uber to keep their players alive. Typically, the best answer to an Uber is simply an Uber of your own. This is known as an Uber exchange. This defensive type of Uber can be the case for blue team as well if they have managed to take map control and need to use Uber to keep it, but typically Ubers for the blue team will be more aggressive and meant to create some sort of advantage for their team. Moving on to the perspective of the Uber target. Much of the theory that I just discussed is up to the medic player to understand since they ultimately control when the Uber is used, or dropped. The medic may be the one determining who to heal, when to pop, and who gets flashed, but the heal targets ultimately decide what to actually do during the charge. This is why knowing and understanding the fundamentals is still important even if you never play medic. Like I said earlier, Übercharge is best used to accelerate your team's progress towards completing the objective. This can be many different things, but the simplest and oftentimes most effective way of helping with the objective in pubs is to get frags. This is pretty self-explanatory. You are invincible and the other team is not. Unless of course they also have an Uber, but I'll get to that in just a bit. When Ubered, you can often throw caution into the wind and simply hold W at the enemy, obliterating anything in your path. If you do use this approach, just be aware of how long you have left Ubered, since a common mistake is to be positioned far too aggressively as your Uber fades, leaving you and your doctor to die a painful death. An alternative to holding W is to simply hold your ground, which is common on defense, especially if you're playing heavy who isn't very good at the whole running and gunning thing. This type of Uber doesn't have to be reserved for defense only, since sometimes the attacking team will need to use Uber to keep control of an important part of the map. I want to mention that just because you're on defense doesn't mean that you should only hold your ground. Holding W with an Uber on defense is oftentimes the correct play, especially if you're able to safely secure more frags by pushing up. I think an underrated play with an Uber on defense is to secure a teleporter kill. On many points, blue team heavily relies on having a level 3 teleporter to keep up the constant pressure, and once the tele goes down, their faster spawn advantage is negated due to a longer rollout time. Since I'm on the subject of teleporters and heavy Ubers, one of my favorite plays is to flank into Spiral as a heavy and then pop an Uber behind the blue team, cutting off their exit and mowing them down. If I'm able to pull this off, it usually delays blue team by at least a minute pushing upward last. Another common situation where holding your ground is ideal is an Uber exchange. More specifically, an exchange in which both Ubers will last for about the same time. In this case, it is usually best to look for un-Ubered players to shoot at and make sure you aren't ending the Uber too aggressively. This will maximize the amount of space your team controls and possibly get you frags if the other team is negligent with their positioning during the exchange. Lastly, you might have to back up during an Uber even though you are currently invincible. This is pretty rare, especially in pubs, but it does happen. The alternative in these cases is to be way too aggressive as the Uber fades, resulting in you and possibly your medic's demise, so it is best to cut your losses and just back up. The other time backing up is usually good is if there are already one or two other heal targets involved in your Uber. The more the medic flashes people, the shorter the duration, so sometimes simply deciding to back up and no longer being involved is ideal. This is especially relevant during Uber exchanges where the duration of your Uber matters quite a bit. For exchanges in which your Uber lasts much longer, like 2.5 seconds or more, you can chase the other team's combo as their Uber is fading. If you're playing Demo, you can trap off their exit and swap to your grenades, or if you're playing Soldier, you can rocket jump to chase. Scout and Pyro can just hold W, and Heavy really isn't able to chase. So, how does one decide where to go? Determining where to move during an Uber is dependent on many factors, such as what class you are playing, how much ammo you currently have, both teams' positioning, and the overall game state. Explaining every possible variable is an impossible task, but I'll try my best to cover the overarching themes. Firstly, as I've already kind of mentioned, the class you are playing greatly impacts how you should behave when invincible. If you're playing a fast-moving combat class such as Scout, Soldier, or Demoman, you can afford to be more aggressive because your strong weapons can get you kills quickly, and then you can use your movement speed to back up to safety if necessary. If you're playing a medium-speed class like Pyro or Shotgun NG, being Ubered can often turn you into an effective damage per second, although you need to be more careful about overextending because you are slower than a Scout and more vulnerable because your weapons are less effective. Knowing how far to push the envelope with these Ubers is largely up to your own game sense. On support classes such as Sniper, Medic, and Spy, being Ubered is uncommon and usually a result of your Medic being forced to use their charge. You can try to make the most of an Uber, but getting no frags is usually better than feeding. Please note that this can also be the case for any class. Sometimes Medic pop Ubers at weird times, and trying to salvage the Uber to get a frag or two can sometimes be worse than just letting it go to waste. Lastly, Heavy is usually too slow and awkward to be an effective Uber target. Situations that Heavy shines and is arguably the best Uber target in the game is where the other team isn't able to run away in time. Heavy Ubers are best for defending an area that the other team is rushing, or catching a group of enemies by surprise and subsequently mowing them down. Another variable is your ammo count. On classes like Heavy and Pyro who do not need to reload, this is a non-issue unless you're out of ammo entirely, but on Demoman or Soldier, it can make or break an Uber. Medic players can see the amount of ammo their heal target has loaded, so hopefully they won't pop an Uber on you when you're not loaded up. If they do, try and make the best of the situation without overextending. Finally, game state is an important factor as well. Ubered players cannot capture objectives, so Ubering players who are trying to push the payload in overtime is usually a bad idea unless you are good enough at Medic to unflash them in order to touch for more time. Another example of an objective-oriented Uber is when your team is under time pressure to do something. Killing a sentry that is denying your team from capping is usually doable without Uber, but if the game is about to hit overtime, then using an Uber to kill the gun preventing your team from winning the game is worth it. Many times, you will be forced to choose between doing one thing or another since you are only invincible for at most 8 seconds. Sometimes you will have multiple targets to shoot at and only enough time to actually take out one. As I mentioned earlier, the best choice is going to help your team do the objective as quickly as possible. Getting Ubered can be overwhelming. In a well-timed Uber, you might have half a dozen or more targets to shoot at, and unless you're playing a class with AoE and they are all bunched up, you will have to make a split-second decision. It often isn't possible to frag everything you see during an Uber, so you will have to prioritize based on your game sense. Generally speaking, the best class to secure a frag on is an opposing medic. The only time it might not be worth it is if you're missing out on one or more other good frags such as demos, snipers, and scouts, and if the medic has little to no charge built up. In a pub environment, you aren't likely to know what Uber percentage the other team's medic has, and usually there will only be 1 or 2 carries on the other team, so getting a medic is almost always worth it. Like I said, snipers, demos, and engineers are also good picks, but securing a frag on any combat class such as scout or soldier who is near the top of the scoreboard is also very good for your team. Experienced pyro players might attempt to airblast you and your medic. In this case, it is almost always best to focus the pyro down as quickly as possible before looking for other kills. Even though Übercharge is obviously really good, it does have some limitations. Ubered players are not immune to knockback, so air blast, sentry guns, heavies, and even sticky traps can send you flying away from where you wish to go. As you probably already know, falling off cliffs when you're Ubered still kills you. You can probably see the logical conclusion when you combine these two things. Here is a brief and likely incomplete list of things that can still kill you when you're Ubered. Telefrags, the saws on Sawmill, and of course, hitting your killbind. Anyway, those are all of the niche counters to Uber that I can think of, if you can even call them counters. I don't have anything else to say about taking Ubers. I hope you enjoyed the video.
You can take it in if you want. That side of it, that side. Play big door, right?
I'm up at 8.
Let's